Button. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Stacy Scott. Dr. Scott is the author of Making Equity Work. He's been a leader in equity programs at Harvard University as well as Boston University. Stacy is a veteran urban superintendent, but most importantly, he leads the equity work at Creative Leadership Solutions and has done so not only throughout the United States, but internationally as well, where his reputation on differentiated instruction and equity speaks for itself. We are so lucky to have Stacy talk on a topic that could not be more timely about equity and cultural competence. Dr. Scott, thanks for joining us.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Reeves, and welcome everyone. Really glad that you're able to join us this afternoon. We will take a quick time together in this hour to sort of share with you some of our thoughts and resources around dealing with equity issues within districts. In particular, we're going to focus on a component of our Building Cultural Competency workshop. This is part of a three-part certification series that we use to be able to build equity capacity. And so we think it's important to build sensitivity around issues of race and culture. We think that it's necessary to have a real understanding of the nature of oppression and inequity, that we need to build resilience around our equity work and think about how do we manage the culture and the systems within which we manage learning and to deal with bias in a way that helps us to be effective to create real high performance for our students. Ultimately, we want to build vision and equity plans that help us to be able to operationalize equity within our districts. And that's what our three-part certification series is all about. And our next slide, it shows the overall competencies that we use to think about building capacity for equity and all the equity work that we do. It's about changing school culture to make equity a core component so that our diversity works effectively and so that we can, in fact, drive high performance for our students. So we have to know how to lead for change, and we have to know how to lead with cultural competence. Change has to be managed, but we also have to be able to think about how do we analyze the critical challenges that we face with an equity lens. How do we assess the culture within which we are and the equity that's going on within our systems so that we can, in fact, lead for change. So those are the core components. Today's workshop, as I mentioned, is focusing on building cultural competence. And in particular, what I want to share with you today is the equity proficiency checkup that we use as a way to kind of enter the conversation around how do we think about our own proficiency in its development and as it operationalizes itself in the work that we do. We are in the midst of a challenging time in our country in terms of the protests and all the angst that exists around the recent death of George Floyd and the others who are suffering in the midst of police brutality. And thinking about equity within our society is no better time than the present to be thinking about that. And so the Equity Proficiency Guide allows us to be able to think about how we build these capacities in terms of our sensitivity around race and culture, understanding the impact of race in terms of the power dynamics and how that impacts our organizational goals. How do we shape and operationalize our equity mindset in a way that helps us to be more effective in this area? And how do we examine the practices and policies that we put in place in order to lead toward equitable outcomes? So we're going to talk about those things in a broad sense. And specifically, though, we're going to talk about sort of how do we manage our equity mindset. So I'll start off by asking a rather general question for you. If we were having a longer workshop, I would ask a series of questions, but I'll leave those questions with you. But I'll start off with the question of, what brings you to this work? I want to think about what are your personal goals? What are the things that you hope to learn in your own development of your equity mindset? So feel free to put in the chat right now as we are sort of starting off, what's at the forefront of your own mind? What are the things that are important to you that you see that you need to learn in this process? And if we had more time, I'd ask you, what are your strengths in terms of cultural proficiency and your equity mindset? And I'd also ask you, what are the areas in where you need to grow? So feel free to write in the chat and we'll be able to sort of read that as we go along and think about the things that you're thinking about as we do this work. So the elements of the equity proficiency checkup, as I like to call it, are belief, awareness, wisdom, action, and measurement. As we build our equity mindset, part of what we're doing is thinking about how do we grow ourselves in each of these critical areas in a way that allows us to be able to operationalize equity in the most effective way. So the first of these is belief. And so I'm going to walk through each of these and we'll use a poll everywhere or the Zoom polling in order to allow you to be able to answer the question of, well, where are you in this area? Now, I'm not going to be able to ask you every question in the checkup list. because time wouldn't permit, but I'm just gonna ask you one question in each section. And so on a scale of 1 to 5, you can answer whether or not this is something that you'd never do or rarely do. Maybe sometimes you do it, which would be a 3 in the middle, or often something that you do on a regular basis, or you do it all the time. So just think about this in this respect. This isn't going to be a total scientific poll, but it is a way for you to gather some data about yourself as you go along. Record your scores on a piece of paper where you're at and on some note paper so that you're able to tally your score when we're all done. So our first question to you today, our first poll will be to ask you the question, equity is an essential feature in my daily actions. So as you think about equity, we haven't necessarily defined it in this conversation, but to what extent is equity something that is a feature in your daily actions, in your daily thinking? And then give you a minute to sort of tally your answers, and we will then carry on after that minute. The question is, check the waiting room and let someone else in there. The question is, how do we think about equity on a daily basis? Is it something that we think about all the time? It's become kind of ubiquitous. I mean, 20 years ago when I started my center was the Center for Understanding Equity. We thought a lot about equity and looked around the country to see what was going on. There was very little happening. Only a couple of states in the country that had equity in their public policy levels, and there weren't centers for equity everywhere. The federal government hadn't created regional centers that were focusing on equity. It's wonderful to see all the effort that's going on now. The question is, does it factor into our everyday decisions? And to what extent is it a core component of what we think about? All right, assuming that we've got enough of the votes in there, we have 82 of the 133. I might leave the poll open for another moment or two. Maybe I'll go on to the next slide while the poll stays open a little longer, Tony, if you don't mind. So the question that I would sort of focus on now is really thinking about how deeply rooted in your belief system is equity? Do we see it showing up in everything we do and say? And it's kind of a question you have to honestly ask yourself whether or not it's something that is really factoring into you the way you think about the world. Is your definition of equity grounded in fundamental principles that human differences and social political values are related to human interaction? That we see them playing themselves out on a regular basis, and we recognize that they're important things that we need to be thinking about and dealing with on a regular basis. It's said by Gary Orfield and others that in many ways, some people may think that that race is more of an urban issue, and that it's often assumed to be largely solved. You know, we've elected a Black president, so we're kind of done, right? There is no more injustice in the world, so we're ready to carry on. Can we talk about something else? At times you'll hear that, at least I certainly know that I do. And so the reality is that these issues, as the protests perhaps make really clear to us, these issues are alive and well. Why don't we go ahead and share the results? Tony, this is probably as good a time as any to do so. As you can see in the results, a lot of you are thinking about equity. It's great to see that it's in your thought processes and that you're thinking about it. And for some, it's sometimes you're recognizing that it's there on occasion, and at other times it is less the focal point. And I think that those are natural and appropriate answers. When we think about belief it really reflects the different levels of our understanding of the values of equity based upon our fundamental beliefs about the nature of human differences. And so it's thinking about the social and political values that we have that relate to our human interactions. And whether we take equity into account is a critical determination as to whether or not we factor in how we're treating people within our society, how we are managing to set up and provision our educational systems in a way that allows us to in a forward way, think about the issues and the implications for those who are within our systems, and making sure we're meeting their needs on a regular basis. That ultimately gets us to the issue of belief. And we should constantly be working on our own beliefs and thinking about how are we managing the culture within our systems in a way that helps everyone in the system to be thinking about the depth to which their own personal beliefs are focused on issues and concerns of equity in their system. Let's go to our second question in the poll. The second issue is the issue of awareness. And so part of the challenge here is that we are all in some way or other have varying levels of awareness of equity. And so the question is, are you aware of the implications of equity in your decision making and in the policies within your organizations? Is it something that you factor in? Is it something that, you know, as you look around you, do other people do it as well? But for yourself, thinking about the degree to which the decisions you make when you're thinking about curriculum, when you're thinking about placement of students, when you're thinking about how provision resources within the system, is equity there and at the core of the processes that we're using. And if you were giving this survey to your staff or to others in your system, just muse, if you will, also on the question of, would they have the same answer? Is it a constant element in the practice of your teams in such a way that you feel it's fully embedded within your system in a thorough way? The votes are almost completely tallied. We're at a minute, so I'll give you another 10, 20 seconds to think about that. The question here is, to what degree are we building our own awareness in these critical issues? The next slide, the issue of awareness comes to the fore. And the issue really is, how aware are we of the needs that exist for equity within our system? What evidence do we have of that awareness? Does our level of cultural competence impact equity beliefs and capacities for equitable action? Do we actually see that the cultural competence that we have is actually impacting our actual action within the system? And so that's a natural and appropriate question for us. The next slide really talks about the fact that part of what we're trying to manage here, as Dr. Eberhardt points out, is that we're often unaware of our own areas of bias. We all have bias. And fortunately, for this particular group, there was a high degree of focus on your awareness, and many in this group recognize that that's a critical issue. The bias is not often really the problem. It's the fact that there's personal, cultural, systemic impact for that bias. And so there's a need for us to be able to be aware of that bias in a way that allows us to determine to what degree is it impacting what we're doing. So there are a variety of ways in which inequity is driven within our systems. And sometimes we don't think about the issues of whether or not there's a controlling elements in terms of language and culture. Are people free to be able to engage in their own language and to use their own culture as a means of expression or a means of learning? You know, are we trying to create perhaps an equality between culture and language in a way that potentially can negate the minority languages or individuals that may not be in a dominant situation? Are there ways in which we are promoting potentially a singular culture in ways that may be at the exclusion of other cultures? We sometimes don't recognize how, even in public policy, sometimes there can be ways in which a primary culture is being promoted. If you look at No Child Left Behind very carefully, you see ways in which the predominant culture, certain strong particular religious views and cultural views are embedded within the public policy in ways that don't often appear obvious, I think, to people. And so I think part of the challenge is to make sure that we are aware of the ways in which there may be, in fact, controlling elements within our society. And you see the evidence of the degrees of that awareness in terms of, do we have a sense of the need for equity? You can see the degrees of cultural competence in terms of how it evolves, impacting our equity stance or our capacity for equitable action. So that's the respect in terms of which awareness is critical for us. Part of what we have to do is recognize that in terms of cultural proficiency, we have to attend to all of the differences within our organization, and they all have to be prioritized in terms of language and culture, ethnicity and race, and the learning styles that are being manifest within our system and the varying communication styles that people have. While race is perhaps a social construct that is somewhat arbitrary and perhaps created by ourselves as a human, nevertheless, it still is something that we need to attend to and to recognize the way people see it and the way it impacts the organizations in which we exist. So building these essential areas of cultural competence are critical for you. And on this call, I may be preaching to the choir in terms of your understanding of the role and the importance of cultural proficiency and what it looks like and how it interacts with what we do. But helping our teams to have language to talk about it is perhaps what hopefully I can help you with in the course of this conversation. So our third element in terms of our equity checkup is to think about our understanding of what equity requires in terms of action and strategy. Now, this one is a little bit more challenging, a little bit more difficult, because here the issue is whether or not we're able to think about the practicality, the practical application of our understanding. We may have awareness, we may believe equity is critical, but do we actually see it operating in our actual practice on a regular basis? And so to the next slide, we call this section wisdom, because in many respects we are thinking about the operational knowledge that we have in terms of what equity requires. And the question becomes, how clearly do we understand the operational mechanisms, what it takes, what the obstacles are, and what we need to do in terms of responding to them on a regular basis. In the next slide, we begin to think about getting to sort of the definition of equity, in a sense, because part of what we're dealing with is understanding how differences will impact policy and decisions, and as well as the teaching and learning that exists within the system. We have to think about the definition, if you will, of equity being about how do we provision our systems in a way that allows us to get to the core concerns and the needs within our organization in a way that allows us to practically act in a way that is that builds efficacy and equity within our systems. We're ready to move on to the next polling question, I think. So, so the question to ask yourself as we sort of move from this section to the next is thinking about our own operational knowledge and our own sense as to the degree to which we are aware of what's happening in terms of equity. The next piece.
And Dr. Scott, if I may,
yes.
Sorry, a question came in from Linda, would like to know the working definition of equity for the purposes of this webinar.
Absolutely. I think that the slide that kind of helps to sort of flesh that out is actually 2 slides down. So why don't we go to slide 28, start there, and go back a slide after that. So thank you, Linda, for your question. For our working definition, we want to talk about equity as really being about the procedures and the processes and the distribution of resources in the organization. Equity can exist when the disparities in the outcomes that are experienced by historically underrepresented populations have been eliminated. In a sense, you're looking at the degree to which we're able to provision a system to be able to meet the needs so that the outcomes for individuals are not predictable on the basis of their demographics. So their race, their economics, the geography of the zip code from which they may be coming into the school do not ultimately determine their outcomes. So in fact, that we've been able to figure out how to provision our systems in a way that allows for us to be able, in fact, to manage systems that are taking these things into account. Let's go slide 27, and then we can go back on to slide 29. So the question really is, have we taken action? How have we taken action? And as a result of the beliefs that we have we in fact been able to use the awareness and knowledge that we have to advance equity in an effective way? So it seems like those of you who have joined us today are a fairly well advanced and sophisticated crowd around these issues. So I'm going to actually kind of keep moving, and then we can get into deeper conversation beyond sort of what I think are sort of more basic elements here. Inclusion here, and defining it, because we want to define equity, we want to define inclusion, really is looking at the issue of participation and really thinking about how, from an inclusive perspective, we can measure it in terms of our actions and our perception. And we want to be able to achieve the inclusion when we know that we have diverse populations and that they're all involved in the decision making. They're all able to impact policy and practice. They're all able to be represented around the table in a way that allows them to be effectively a part of the critical equity decisions that are being made. So you're, I think, a very advanced crowd that's here, so that's good. So also, closing out the conversation around actions, here the issue is having an orientation toward action is ultimately fed by our awareness and our beliefs, and indicates the degree of activity evident in the person or in the organization, and that's where we can then define our action. So just to sort of finalize the 3 major areas we've been defining today, when you define the issue of diversity, here the issue really is, who's getting asked to the party? And ultimately, in terms of inclusion, one might summarize that by saying, are you being asked to help plan the party? You're included in the thought processes and the decision making. But equity ends up being a little bit more transformational in terms of being able to get to the issue of redefining what it means to plan the party, who has the power to influence the nature of the party, invite people to the party. Equity redistributes the nature of the power that is used in a way that allows for more people to be engaged in the actual construction of the reality that we are in.
And Dr. Scott, a question just came in from Jamie. How do we change a larger issue of how schools are funded? This is one of the most serious issues that plague all of us. The system in how schools are funded creates inequities that one can't even count on all 10 fingers.
Yeah, I mean, there's a critical challenge in Massachusetts as an example of the way different states have attempted to deal with that issue. We've attempted to recalibrate the formula within the state in order to be able to more effectively balance the needs of those parts of the state, the urban districts in particular, that have had increasing levels of migration, increasing levels of students with limited and informal formal education or interrupted formal education, homeless students. And so by attempting to re-engineer the formula, they've been able to improve upon the work in the 90s where the formula was originally created. It had some equity balancing related elements in it. It was necessary to really upgrade it in a significant way. And so part of the challenge was to be able to re-engineer that formula in a way that would increase the capacity from a state level to balance out the playing field in a way that would be helpful. Part of the challenge is that it's very difficult to create legislation to change the state constitution, which ultimately would be necessary to be able to change the way local funding and local control occurs within school districts, certainly here in Massachusetts and in most other states in the country. So the challenge is to be able to use the state and federal mechanisms to create additional balancing so that districts can have more equal resources. In the state of Mass, go ahead. I'm ready for
I apologize. Another question prior to launching our next poll from Daniel. Is there such a thing as equitable freedom?
I might ask for greater clarity on the question. Equitable freedom. I mean, I think that it is possible to create a society where there is effective balancing of the three essential issues that you are always trying to balance when dealing with issues of society and equity. There's a certain amount of liberty that everyone wants to have to be able to do what they want to do, when they want to do it, how they want to do it, and to have the freedom to be able to exist within the society in a way that gives them the ability to freely come and go as they need to. And then also there's a certain amount of efficiency within the system that ultimately is the mechanism for attempting to balance the needs of different people over and against each other. And so you always have decisions about whether this is environmentally safe, whether this is an appropriate, liberty that you should have when it may constrain the liberty of someone else. So you're looking to figure out how to balance those needs in any social, any polity, any society, in order to be able to create the greatest amount of liberty and freedom and efficiency within the society as a whole. So the nature of any society, but certainly in democracy, those are the things that are being balanced. And so the challenge is, there always has to be a debate and a bit of a wrestling match as to how to help people talk to each other across those differences in a way that allows for the greatest degree of needs to be met across those differences.
Thank you, Dr. Scott.
Sure, and that's great. The questions at any time are good, and so we'll take this poll, and hopefully you'll come back in with even more questions. So finally, in this final question, where we think about belief, awareness, we think about wisdom in terms of just understanding how to apply our knowledge, we think about the action and the actual application of that knowledge, and then finally there's the issue of measuring our progress toward equity and gathering data in a way that allows us to be able to determine whether we're in fact able to articulate, are we making progress or not? So we need to have mechanisms that will help us, in fact, to be able to answer the question of how do we know when we are improving, which requires that we step back, understand the landscape upon which we're operating, understand what the variables are that we're working to improve, and both evaluating the strategies we're using to manage change and also the outcomes themselves. So are you measuring using qualitative and quantitative measures what it means to be equitable? One example of that challenge would be looking at issues of disproportionality. Orfield talks about the fact that only about 50% of our Black students around the country, our Native Americans, Latinx students graduate. And for African Americans, et cetera, those numbers are even lower than the 50% that we might see around the country. So we have ongoing challenges. Are we using the data to be able to explain to us what we think of the critical challenges, and then to be able to help us to be able, in fact, to move in that direction. Not surprised that, for some, that's something that's not as frequently done. And so we need to build our skill and capacity on defining the problems in a way that allows us to be able, in fact, with that measurement, to be able to, in fact, determine the best strategies for moving forward. A lot of what we talk about in the series of workshops, which begin with this sort of more basic cultural competency workshop, to the managing culture and the strategic planning elements with an equity lens, is to think about getting to building a plan that is sufficient to be able to understand the critical challenges that we're facing, and then to create strategic responses to them that have high reliability of being effective. To do that, you have to measure. You have to have indicators of equity management in a way that allow you to be able to determine the efficacy of your actions toward equitable outcomes. And what a lot of systems don't do is, first of all, analyze and describe their challenges and problems sufficiently enough to be able to define effective strategy and action to respond. And then they don't create internal mechanisms for measuring that are effective ways for them to be able to determine, are they in fact making progress? So those are things that we certainly can work on. So as we've attempted to think about measuring our own individual growth, we focused on these 5 critical elements. Here are the 5 stages of development that you might find yourself in, depending upon the level of your scores in these different areas. And so if you scored yourself at always, you would have given yourself a 5 in the first category. If you scheduled yourself or scored yourself as often on a few of these, then you would get then you get 4 points for that particular answer. So add your own answers up in each category. And if, let's say, for example, you gave yourself a 4 in each category or a 3 in each category, then your score would then end up being around 15 or 20. And that would give you an idea whether you're sort of in an emerging category, which gives you the ability to, or demonstrates that you're sort of thinking through the issues, working them out, but needing to continue to build either awareness or clarity on what the action should look like, or how to measure that action, and how to operationalize it. And for most of us, as we're in large systems, that's our challenge. It's figuring out, how do we operationalize whatever level of development we're at? How do we in fact build our capacity to operationalize the strategies that we have? Partially the challenge here is that we've got to build a sense of hope. We have to build clear accountability measures into systems and help them to be able to embrace the goals that we're setting, and at all levels, because it has to be from the school committee through the superintendent's goals, through even the teacher's professional development goals, and each department has to plan and set goals in a way that helps them to be a part of provisioning the system for meeting the needs of all concerned. And so this 5th question certainly indicates the interest and the need to continue to grow our capacity for measuring, but many of you are doing well in terms of your overall growth in this area. And so as you reflect upon that, think about the areas in which you can help yourself to grow, whether it's continuing to sort of look for operationalizing mechanisms for operation what you already know. My sense would be that often what we need to build, even as professionals who have been practicing in many areas, is looking at a variety of strategies that can in fact help us to move our systems forward, and thinking about how do we in fact bring those strategies to the table in a way that allows them to build the reliable success that we need. Pause there and see, Tony, whether there's any critical questions that are out there.
None at this time, but ladies and gentlemen, just as a reminder, please send questions and comments in using that chat feature, and we'll be glad to raise those for Dr. Scott.
So, one of the things that's critical here is to talk about the degree to which we work toward transformation, and the degree to which we are thinking with a critical lens about the current sort of realities within our system, about the nature of racism, bias, discrimination within our current systems, and how do we unravel the different sources of inequity? I mean, think about on a national scale right now, about the challenges, the equity challenges that we see around the nation. We look at the responses to COVID-19 and the differential degree to which Native Americans, African Americans in urban areas, group by group, the differential treatment and resources that are available within this country indicate very clear and obvious degrees of bias, or ways in which resources are provisioned differently to different groups of people. How do we see those challenges? How do we in fact see what the different strategies are that might in fact be more equitable than the ones that are sometimes chosen. How do we make sure that we're doing those things that we know will balance the needs? And how do we do it at every particular level? So there are at least 4 levels that we want to be thinking of when we think of transformation. And those include ideological, institution, interpersonal, and internalized. Tony, I noticed some questions coming in. Let me pause to make sure that I shouldn't take one of those before I go deeper into these 4 categories.
All right, so from Phoebe, what resources or seminal pieces might you suggest to start this work in schools?
So I think that Doug Reeves just put out a new book, Equity and Excellence, and I certainly would encourage sort of thinking about that work, which attempts to help us to think about the power of writing, driving higher performance and higher improvement. I think we want to think about the role of bias in our systems. I've mentioned Dr. Eberhard's book and thinking about how we can step back and look at bias within our systems more effectively. I think we have to sort of think, from a critical analysis, look at the systems within the nation, whether it's looking at Dr. Alexander's book around the school to prison pipeline, to step back and critically think about what are the ways in which our schools are in some ways participating in a process that only continues to exacerbate the negative cycle of underperformance and oppression within our society. So we have to think about how do we sort of break that cycle. And we have to think about what are the ways in which we can teach our children to think critically about their own resources in a way that'll help them, about their own processes of development, so that will help them to critically grow and to develop to new levels.
I inadvertently, sorry, Stacy, please
just
continue.
mention one more thing before you jump in. So I'm, writing, Making Equity Work was my first book in 2005, and I'm actually writing a next draft of it, because part of what I think is necessary is to deconstruct equity challenges and to give lots of examples from my own work as a superintendent about what are the critical challenges that we face in that seat, and how do we strategically come into a district, begin to do the assessment that's necessary. So in the second workshop, we'll do another one of these next week. We'll talk about district level assessment. How do you do that assessment? And then how do you use that information to create the capacity of your teams to move forward with that data to make change? And so then looking at from an organizational developer's perspective, how do you change your organizations such that they are aligned organizationally? So you have to literally change the structure of how the departments exist, and then how they interact with each other in a way that causes them to be able to impact equity in a new and a different way. And it's really a transformational way that's designed to build innovation so they can think through the answers to the current problems they face in a different and entirely new way. Finishing that book up now, so hopefully over the course of the summer, it'll become available in the summer and the fall.
Thank you, sir. And inadvertently, my eyes skipped over the question from Robin, but it was very similar, fortunately, to Phoebe's regarding resources and books. So from Nelda, a statement, assessments available to review data for qualitative and quantitative growth. So I'm interpreting that as a question, are there any assessments that might help identify equity issues?
So some of the elements that I'm going to, in the next seminar on Wednesday, I'm going to show you the equity progress assessment that I've created, which was designed to give districts the ability to analyze 4 key areas in terms of equity: academics, belongingness, commitment to dismantling racist structures, and diversity. We designed this as a part of the Harvard Reimagining Integration for Diverse and Equitable Schools program. We've used it with districts over the last 4 years as they've attempted to do assessments of their district, using the rubric design in this tool, and then to use this as a mechanism for beginning their planning process as a system. At that point, usually what I pull them into is the strategic planning process that I use to help them to design a plan going forward. So I think that I've also designed sort of some other assessment tools that are designed to help build transformational thinking, so that you can sort of think about the basic structures more in depth, human resources, finance, in a more explicit way. So those are tools that I'll be talking to more in the next session on this topic.
And from Linda, what kinds of things can I do as a teacher to impact my school district? She writes, I sometimes feel helpless to take actionable steps that actionable steps that will impact the bigger systems?
Been spending a lot of time thinking about equity in the classroom. And so actually we're inaugurating this summer a workshop called Equity in the Classroom. And so the focus there is to think about, from a teacher's perspective, how do we, as a middle school teacher, how do we look at all the elements of the classroom? We're going to create actually sort of an online digital tool that help us to sort of keep focused on, do a little bit of a checkup of the things that I'm doing in my classroom, my setup, my pedagogy, my curriculum. How am I able to sort of assess each of these areas and look at the ones that I'm able to sort of grow in, and then sort of come back to that on a regular basis to monitor my progress. In our Equity in the Classroom workshop, we're going to focus on sort of elements of thinking about how do we differentiate what's going on in the classroom to meet the needs of students in a different way. I'm excited in a sense by, the challenges that COVID-19 has presented to us. What I'm excited about is that it's forcing us to think about the classroom differently. Really, the reins are back in the hands of the teachers, because the teachers are being asked to think through the challenge of how do we meet the needs of students differentially, if we have to treat them each as individuals because maybe they're at home and we're still having to educate them even though they're not in the classroom. Or when they come back to the classroom, their learning needs are going to be so, the range is going to be so increased because they've been learning different things in different ways at different rates. So we will have to individualize instruction even more. And while that's challenging to our teachers in the classroom, it's a challenge that many of our teachers have mastered, especially our special ed teachers who understand how to individualize instruction in a way that meets the needs of each individual student. The challenge, I'll say, to our teachers is to our systems to support our teachers, because that can be challenging and overwhelming to have to do that level of individualized instruction, especially if you have 30, 40 kids in your classroom or 150 kids that you're managing because you're a social studies teacher or whatever. So the school districts have to step up and support teachers so they're not overwhelmed by that challenge, by giving them the resources necessary and the support to collaborate with other teachers to make that individualized instruction possible. So what the teacher can do is to think about the nature of that challenge, really push to the front of the line in terms of thinking through what's that going to look like? How can I individualize my instruction in a way that moves each student along their continuum of learning in a way that is effective for them? Because to me, that's true equity. Every student's getting what they need to reach the same targets that everybody needs to meet. And I think our teachers are talented enough to be able to figure out how to do that. That's, I think, the challenge for us at this point.
If I could just add one parenthetical note, Dr. Scott is being overly modest. One of the things that he has done is create equity certification programs at the district and building level. And he's quite right. I mean, the answer to equity is not just in policy, that's a piece of it. But if we don't get this done at the building and classroom level, then all the policies in the world wind up becoming rhetoric. And I think his work that get down to the building and the classroom level is really where equity certification happens. Sorry, Dr. Scott, go ahead.
No, that's okay. Tony, do you have more questions?
A few logistical questions regarding copies of the presentation and the recording. So just as a quick reminder to everyone, this is being recorded and will be posted to our website. Once the processing is finished, we typically get the recordings up within 48 hours, and we will email registrants copies of the slides subsequent to the webinar. And Linda said, thank you very much, Dr. Scott, for the response to her question.
Absolutely. Well, as I continue to think about Robin's question and those others that have asked about reading items, I'm recently reading some things that they've been put on the commons, the intellectual commons, for us all to sort of look at. But there are things around thinking strategically about responding to crises. And those might be things maybe we'll put, I can sort of put into those who are connected to our mailing list, and something that we can mail out. What I'm finding is that more and more people are trying to think strategically about how do we respond to the current challenge? How do we respond to it in a strategic way? And this is a particular resource that I've recently come across that gives us some real strategic thinking about transformation, paradigm shifting. What do we need to do in a 3 month, 6 month, year, 3 to 5 year sort of perspective? And those are the kinds of things that I'm writing about in my book, but also that I think that we need to be thinking about as we try to help our systems organize them toward managing change.
And from Ramona, Dr. Scott, please discuss the role of the building leadership as educators take their cues from this leadership.
Absolutely. So in 2005, I designed the Making Equity Work workshop which is part of follow on from the Making Equity Work book that I think was alluded to in the chat. That was my first book on the topic. The goal of the Making Equity Work workshop is what we now have as our part 2 Managing Culture Change workshop. My sense was that what principals really needed, and we weren't supporting them sufficiently in our professional development and certification programs, was understanding as to how to change culture. How do you really manage the culture of an organization, the underlying elements of culture in a way that allows you to impact the values and the beliefs and the traditions and the processes that are used that really ultimately determine the performance of the adults in the building and the kids in the building. So if you want students to perform at high levels, then you have to manage the psychology of their performance. You have to manage an understanding as to how they are believing in themselves, how they are bringing their effort to work in a way that manages their attributions, their sense of helplessness, their sense of goal setting. All those elements of the psychology of performance have to be managed in a high performing environment. So I make sure that principals that I train understand those elements and how those help create the growth mindset that Carol Dweck and others talk about. If you want to create that mindset, you have to understand the underlying components of it that teachers use every day in the classroom to structure students so that they feel confident and effectively able to drive learning within the classroom.
So a quick question that came in just to make an announcement. I also put it in the chat. So the question was, when is the next in the series? Next Wednesday at 3 p.m. A comment from Meg, Dr. Scott: it is hard to respond to this challenge if the funding for schools is cut or so full of inequity. And there are a couple other questions down here as well, but I'll let you address that one.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question, because it's going to get harder, actually. Next year is going to be a little tough. And given the nature of the pain that we're going to experience next year, it's strange for me to say it's going to be a little tough. But the reality is that the year after that, for a year or two, it's going to be harder because of the nature of the funding cycles. Is that we'll buffer ourselves against the change that we're sort of, maybe weren't expecting going into next year, but it's a little harder over the long term while the economy re-engineers itself and re-engages so that taxes begin to return again. And until local communities are able to regain the taxes that they've lost, they're going to have to cut funding in very, very significant ways. So we're in for 2 or 3 years of some difficult time around funding. So to your question, as a superintendent, my challenge was always to protect the classroom, protect my teachers' state of mind so that they could stay effective and care for children and be present with them. I think that it's going to be about going down, to kind of basic level, making sure that every student is learning, using what resources we have to make sure they have the technology that they need in the midst of this sort of COVID environment. My great-grandmother was a teacher in the one-room schoolhouse in Macon, Georgia, and my great-uncles were teachers in the Detroit and Boston, and the ones that moved from the south to the north. So they kind of instilled in me the sense of what we do as teachers in the classroom in the midst of everything else falling apart. We know how to do what we need to do, which is care for kids, keep them learning. So I think that the challenge is to challenge our systems to sort of make sure that the priorities are straight, make sure that they are taking care of the least of these first, and making sure that they're not suffering in the midst of the current change that we're having to go through. And if we can do that, then at least we won't exit this particular crisis with our students farther behind. That's why, the third in the series in the equity certification is strategic planning with an equity lens. Because unless you drive that change forward with clear planning, then you can't manage these funding problems.
Yeah, this is Doug. I would just, because Dr. Scott is fundamentally a nicer and more diplomatic person than I am, I want to say something about funding. Look, there's a lot of CARES funding coming in right now, and if you take away one thing on funding analysis, it's the following: practices, not programs. What I see all the time is school systems that are strapped for money, spending money on programs that evaporate with the wind, when they ought to be investing in people, on practices. And that's what Dr. Scott certainly has provided. And just in the last few days, I've seen districts spending lots of money on things that people are basically not using curriculum programs, technology programs, and others. So invest in your people, not just buying stuff.
So to respond, I see a couple of things in the chat that I think would be worth pulling out. One is there a way, towards certification for our local districts and LEAs? So we're trying to provide additional resources for certification so that folks can have a clear path to really feeling competent around these issues. You know, it's okay to be just starting out or to try to figure out how to analyze your systems or understand what things have been inequitable and where those inequities come from and how to begin shifting them within the society, but it's difficult to do that without some help. So we've tried to create some resources that allow for the building of cultural competency for those for whom that is not a strength. For many of you, this seminar may have been in some ways sort of basic because these are things that are familiar to you, but maybe it gives you some language to think about how to talk to others. That was the goal in creating the equity proficiency checkup, to create some simple ways of talking about the 5 elements that are in there. So, you know, you want to sort of create training processes so that your teams are able to, in fact, build their capacity. I see the question from Phoebe about the psychology of student performance. I have copies of Making Equity Work from 2005 version, which certainly is my attempt to sort of deconstruct the psychology of performance for students and to talk about how principals and teachers in the classroom work to manage that psychology so that students are able to be liberated from their whatever may be holding them back in terms of their own background, whatever's in their head that could cause them to underperform. And another book that's going to be coming out later this year is a book on confidence. And I'm co-authoring that book. And that book is really going to break down confidence and the 12 variables and elements that we all manage when we're trying to manage our own development or the development of kids. And so that's going to be, I think, a very powerful work. So keep your eyes out for that, and we'll make sure we get that to you as well.
And ladies and gentlemen, in case you missed it in the chat, Dr. Reeves has included his personal contact information and email for those wishing to seek further consultation here. If you have questions for Dr. Reeves or Dr. Scott, please contact Doug Reeves directly and he'll be sure to pass those on. You also see Dr. Scott's contact information there on the screen, and you may email us at service@creativeleadership.net as well to request an additional consultation.
Stacy, I want to thank you for your leadership this afternoon, as well as for your leadership nationally and internationally on this important issue of equity. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you all for joining us today. Thank you for your questions, your comments. I'll be reading anything in the chat that we didn't notice. Feel free to send us an email if you want further dialogue or conversation about that. We'd be eager to make sure you're supported. If we didn't quite get to it here, we want to get to it later. So get in dialogue with us and we'll try to make sure we get you some resources. I should probably put a book list in the next presentation so that people, because I don't think off the top of my head about what are those books that are on my own nightstand. So I'll do that to make sure we have a good list for folks in the next session.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.